All right. Well, hello. So glad to have the opportunity to continue our study in Ecclesiastes. We had a little bit of a time gap in between our last study. I had a little bit of a unfortunate sickness that sprang up, and so I was unable to participate. But in much better news, Trey and his wife welcomed in their third child into the world last week, and so it was even though I was not particularly enjoying the week, it was a wonderful thing to hear about that. So we're very glad for the Haskett family as they continue to grow. But we are back into a normal schedule now this week. And so we're going to get into Ecclesiastes chapter 3, which is going to start out with a really powerful poem that really kind of, I think, sets the tone for a lot of the rest of the book when we're getting into this. And so we'll go ahead and dive right into it. We're joined once again by Trey Haskett from Tupelo, Mississippi, and Greg Kline from Birmingham, Alabama. So we're very glad to continue this study. So we're going to go ahead and start in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and I'm going to read for us verse 1 through 8. The text says, "There's an appointed time for everything, and there's a time for every event under heaven, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing, a time to search and a time to give up as lost, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together, a time to be silent and a time to be speaking, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace." And so we see the author puts us together this poem for us, and this poem is very pretty clearly structured. You've got a series of what is often called merisms. And so it's this poetical device where you're essentially using two contrasting ideas. And really what it's doing with this series of events is talking about the totality of life. And so between, giving birth and dying, planting and uprooting, kill and heal, all these different comparisons to contrast, the concept here is kind of the presenting the totality of life, the wholeness of life. And so this is not really a prescriptive list that, okay, let's figure out what time is the proper time to kill. Let's figure out what the proper time to throw stones is. That would be kind of, I think, missing the point of what's going on here. Really, it's summed up in that first verse where there's an appointed time for everything. There's a time for every event under heaven. And what the speaker is going to kind of do is use this idea of the totality of time to then draw some comparisons and some contrast between how God views the totality of time and the limits of mankind being able to view time. So, Trey, what do you got some thoughts on this section?
Yeah, as we see those contrasts there in this great long poem, and it's one of the longest poems of its type here. It can be very easy to get into these things and want to try to figure out, I think, as you were getting at, what is the proper time for these things, and make sure we're living according to the proper times. And some of these things, we look at like time to kill, time to weep, time to mourn. Those to us seem like things that we want to avoid. And so what we end up doing when we think about this is sometimes maybe we want to avoid certain things in this list and try to gravitate or move towards other things in this list. And I really don't think that's the point here. And so I want us to respect verse 1 and get back to verse 1, that all of these things and the whole gambit of life, all of these things, there's a proper season, there's a proper time for them. And one of the things that we're going to see, I think, is you were getting at also, is that God is really behind this sort of ordered time that we experience in this life, and that we come to understand and come to see in some sense. And so let's not be so quick to try to avoid some times and jump to other times. Appreciate the time for what it is. And I think the writer will have something to say more about that here in a little bit. And we will probably comment on that as well. But Greg, what thoughts do you have here on any of these contrasts in particular that stand out to you, or is there something here that you want to touch on?
Yeah, I think the fact that the writer knew what was going to happen in 2020 stands out to me. At the end of verse 5, it says there's going to be a time to refrain from embracing. The foresight is, as always, spot on. Of course, there's a time for everything, and really what Ecclesiastes chapter 3 shatters is the illusion of control. Trey, you had mentioned this, and Andrew, certainly it was behind what you were saying, the idea that we want to kind of choose the good parts. We want to celebrate. We want to celebrate those times of birth and leave out the death, leave out the time to weep, leave out the time to mourn. And that's not how life works, even if we wanted it to. Regardless of the fact that verse 11 is going to show God makes things beautiful and in their time, is this concept that I can't control life. And in the writer's quest, he's trying to figure out, where is purpose? What does God want from me? What does he want? What am I supposed to be doing? Where is fulfillment? Where is satisfaction? Where is that purpose? And the cycle of life shows no matter what you try to do, we are just parts of the system, so to speak. We don't control it. God does. And so I have to take the bad times and find some good things out of them. And one of those things that comes out, of course, in verse 4, a time to weep and a time to mourn, is to remember who allowed for creation to have these types of emotions, these types of feelings. Well, God did. And so if I have emotions and I feel them, there needs to be an outlet or purpose for them. And I think that's what sometimes we need to be spending more time on, rather than saying, this is bad, this is unfair, why is it? It's rather, what can I do with it? Even in times in the New Testament, it would talk about in the book of James, for example, count it all joys, my brothers, when you encounter various trials, that it could strengthen even your faith. Your faith could produce steadfastness. If a trial, if a temptation can produce some sort of positive benefit, then certainly some of these sessions of reflecting on life can too. And while I joke about refraining from embracing, certainly we've learned lessons even in a time of being kind of stuck in our houses. Like, number one, we can record videos from them. We've gotten a lot better at figuring out technology. Not going to have it figured out. Probably by the time we don't need it, we'll have it all set to go again. But we learn things from opportunities we would never get otherwise. And so we have to realize we're not in control, but we can make the best of what we do have and realize that God is in control and trust him to have his way done. I think that's really going to lead in well to the next section. We'll go ahead and pick up that reading in verse 9. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away. Andrew, why don't you start us off? What do you see here as standing out in this writer's quest?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of what you just mentioned in your comments. I think were excellent. You've got this question in verse 9. What profit is there to the worker from that which he toils? And we've seen the author ask this question multiple times to date, kind of seeking out this purpose. What is the understanding that's going on? And we see again that same that idea. I've seen the task. Other translations might call it the burden, the heaviness, which God has set, given the men, sons of men to occupy themselves. And then he draws this contrast between God, who has made everything appropriate, who has ordered it just like we've seen it in this poem, where everything has its proper time and its proper place. And then we get this really interesting discussion of mankind's perspective on this. And we get this really fascinating statement. He has set eternity in their heart. And so God has allowed mankind to understand that he doesn't have the full picture. He has given this kind of spark within man's, and you can call this the conscience. Perhaps this is related to the soul of man. But mankind understands there's something greater going on than just his limited perception. Because the reality is that mankind, while we kind of understand the concepts in this poem in verse 1 through 8, we don't see the grander work. I think it was Derek Kidner talked about this and said it's almost like a blind man gripping at a tapestry. And it's, if you've ever looked at like the Bayeux tapestry or one of these, really ornate hangings, there's so much detail and the threads weave in and out. But, if you're up close and blind, you're trying to see how all of this connects. And God, on the other hand, is backwards and can see the whole picture going on. And the difficulty for mankind and the frustration that the author is expressing is that mankind doesn't have that full picture. Mankind can't see why all of this is taking place. And that's going to lead into what he's going to talk about the next section about justice and the frustration of that system. But the conclusion, and Koheleth kind of tips his hand here in the final section, is that don't try to figure it out. You're never going to succeed in that. there is no getting the full picture. That belongs to God. And so your task is to accept your limited perspective, accept your limits, and trust God has control of this. Trey, what do you make of these verses?
Yeah, what you mentioned there, Andrew, is just so difficult for us, isn't it? We want to have control. We want to be able to know what's coming next, and so we've got some sense, as you mentioned, that there's something bigger going on, something larger going on, but we can't always quite tell what exactly that is and where everything is going. And I think that really hurts us, particularly as 21st century Americans. We like to have control. We like to be able to plan our schedules, say where we're going, when we're going to do those things, et cetera, and so on. And part of what this is saying to us is that we just simply don't know what God is doing all the time. And I think about, if I can use a personal example here, as you mentioned, we just welcomed our son, Lincoln, and we're so excited, so proud to have him here with us. But one of the very difficult things for us was that back in April, the doctor was telling us, all right, any day now. And just based on some of Jordan's symptoms and the fact that we have had a couple of early pregnancies thus far, we were always kind of expecting, all right, maybe beginning of to middle of May, this child was going to come. And so we're waiting and we're waiting and we're ready, and it doesn't come. And then a couple more days pass, another week, a few more weeks. And at this point, we're getting to the end of May and we still don't have a child. And we're thinking, all right, we thought we had this thing figured out. And now, so Lincoln was born on June 3rd, to the surprise of all of us, which was actually his due date, which doesn't really happen very often. And so playing this waiting game and thinking that we've got some grasp of what's going to happen and when it's going to happen, at least for me, this experience sort of told me that I don't have it all figured out. And neither do the doctors, as smart as they are and as much schooling as they've had and all that, et cetera. And of course, still trust doctors and all that. But we don't quite know as much as we think that we do. And that can be scary on the one hand, but I think on the other hand, to know that there is a wise God with a beautiful mind who's behind all of it, who's controlling all of it, I think that can be helpful. And so part of what I think is going on here is that when he says that we can't figure it out, we don't know, that's almost a despairing comment in one sense. But then he goes on to talk about how it's God directing this, it's God doing it. God is bringing back what's already been. He is the one working in these cycles, and therefore our lot, don't try to figure it out, don't try to grasp the time, but enjoy it, be in the moment, be present. And if I can just be honest, that's one of the things that I regret about the past month and a half that we had been living in, always waiting, always expecting something to happen, but never actually appreciating, or not doing it at least as much as we ought to, the moments that we actually had. And so let's let go of control. Let's let go of the pretense of control, because really we don't have much at all, and trust in God and enjoy the moment. And I think that's exactly what he's getting at there, verse 12 and 13, that we live life in a timed, in an ordered system, enjoy the time that we're in. And Greg, to your point earlier, and maybe you want to talk about this more, when you were mentioning the mourning and the weeping, that there's a proper time for that, and there's good even in that. And so be present in that moment. Greg, do you have any thoughts on the rest of this section?
Yeah, I think there's another turn of exception here in verse 13, that man should take pleasure in all his toil, that this is God's gift to man. Despite Trey's assault on our fine medical community, the idea that he had to cover by saying trust doctors quickly with, we all just do the best we can, or, we should be at our work. And in verse 13, when he says that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil, this is God's gift to man. Notice very carefully, this is what God's gift is, to take pleasure in his toil. That's a little counterintuitive, right? Just like the weeping and mourning being apart from God, that there is something good to be had. And not only do we have to give up control, I think Trey had some great analogies with that, and even the last month, and think, well, what could I have done with this? In retrospect, if I had accepted that as it is. But verse 12, I perceive that there is nothing better than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. To accept that and to embrace it. Those are different statements, though. To accept that I'm not in control, to accept that I'm the blind man, and maybe in my case, I am the blind man, but the blind man in front of the tapestry, not seeing all its details, to accept that as true and to live it are different. Because if I accept that as true and then I live it, that means I can just do my best. I can go to work. I can figure out what God wants from me on a day-to-day basis and find satisfaction there. It's when I look for more, that more which I'm unqualified for, that's the dissonance between a contented soul and one who submits to God. And sometimes it is that word that's the problem. It's submissive. I don't like the fact that I cannot find it. At the end of verse 11, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. The earlier we accept that, the better. You know, there's a lot of things I love about visiting different places, and Disney World's one of my favorites. But as soon as I accept that there is going to be a long line for the Mickey Head ice cream bar, the better. Right? I can still enjoy it, but if I accept that I'm going to have to stand behind someone who's probably sweaty and it's going to take 10 minutes to get there, I can complain about that, or I can realize, hey, there's something better waiting and get there. God has told us, hey, you enjoy not just the end, though. You enjoy the whole thing. Take advantage of where you are and realize that these are very much individual gifts from God. God looks at it that way. Sometimes I don't. That means I have the problem and I need to kind of correct that. And of course, the writer's going to continue on in this journey. Trey, would you mind reading verses 16 through the end of the chapter for us to see how he somewhat pivots here?
Yeah, absolutely. It says, moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness. And in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. And I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and every work. I said in my heart, with regard to the children of man, that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes downward to the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? You know, here again, we've got this idea, while we do have a transition of sorts, we're still continuing on with this idea that everything is ordered and there is a time for everything. In fact, verse 17 sort of repeats that refrain that we get at the beginning of this chapter in verse 1, that there's a time for every matter, for every work. And we can't always see what is going on. In fact, one of the things that I think is frustrating to the preacher here as he's going through this is that when he looks at the reality, at least as he sees it, everything kind of ends up in the same place. Whether you're man or a beast, all die. There's all of this injustice. It seems to be a very depressing and very honest, maybe at times, view of this world. And yet, verse 22, there's a turn there to something better, something more than just, well, we're all going to die, so let's throw our hands up and just face whatever this life is going to give us. No, and Greg, I think maybe this goes to your point earlier about accepting and embracing. It's one thing to accept we're all going to die. It's another thing to embrace that and to live in this moment, making the best of the time that we have been given. You have any more thoughts on that, Greg?
Yeah, I do. I think verse 17 really kind of pivots with what you're saying into that acceptance and embracing. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. It's very common, and especially right now, let's just be honest, that this idea of justice is very much on our minds. But the only way to get past it from a life is vain kind of way is to say somebody is watching, somebody is calculating, somebody's in control and going to handle it. And it is God. God sees everybody. He sees what I perceive as injustice. He sees what I perceive as justice. He sees when I struggle. He sees when I am enjoying the fruits of my labor. God sees all this, and this is one of those important steps that even transfers to the New Testament. Why is it in Romans chapter 12 that I don't seek vengeance? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is God's the one who's qualified to make that judgment. So if God's going to judge, if it's his place to punish, then I need to stop worrying about that and start living my life. And what does he say in Romans 12? Live peaceably with others as far as it depends on you. So rather than contemplating those big life questions, and I don't mean just thinking about it wrong, I mean trying to be actively discouraged by it to the point where I say, well, I'm not going to get an answer and that upsets me. Well, stop worrying about that. You worry about what God has shown you. Look at the part of the tapestry that you are on, that you can enjoy, and then add that to yourself. I think there's that positive uptick you said in verse 22. I saw there's nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his law. Right? We have something worth doing. God put joy there. God put pleasure there. We have to accept God's gift and make the best of it. Andrew, as you get work towards wrapping us up, do you really see that same type of shift here, that at least a little bit of ray of sunshine and an otherwise downer of a section?
Yeah, I think this, as the preacher so often is, I think he's introducing some tension here with really two perspectives. And so the first is, so the problem that he's introducing, and he's already talked about it a little bit, he's going to continue to talk about in chapter 4, is this problem of injustice, this problem of oppression and wickedness. And from an Old Testament perspective, this is rampant in pretty much every time period you see Israel going through. It's rampant when they're slaves in Egypt. It's rampant when they become free and start making their own country. It's rampant in the kingdom. Injustice is a constant throughout the Old Testament. And so the preacher goes to this point, and he makes this really profound point in 17 that God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man. One of the things that's important to remember is that from an Old Testament perspective, they don't have some of the same revelation we do about the afterlife, about what happens after you die. You see Job really explores this concept, and kind of the overall picture you get is of uncertainty, is we're not exactly sure what takes place after this life. A lot of times death is described as going down to Sheol, going down to the pit. And so death in the Jewish system had a lot more finality than what we think of when we think of the Christian mindset. And so Koheleth is kind of drawing on that tension of, we know that God has promised justice. We know that God is a just God. And yet from a purely empirical standpoint, when you look at the world around us, it doesn't always work that way. It doesn't always seem like that's the case, that sometimes even the wicked don't ever face justice in this life. And so I think he's kind of drawing on that tension that it seems like sometimes you just die and there is no justice. But he makes this really interesting point after having basically said that everybody dies just like the beast of the earth, man goes to dust. He says in verse 21, who knows that the breath of man ascends upward and the breath of the beast ascends downward to the earth? And he's introducing kind of this question that he himself doesn't have the answer for. But he says perhaps there is more than just this life. We face the problem that sometimes justice doesn't occur here, but if we know that God is just, and if we know that God sees time in a different way than we do, then perhaps it's true that God will be just after the fact. Now, we have the benefit of further revelation that confirms what the preacher is kind of suggesting and wondering about here. But we see, I think this is an important concept in the Old Testament of kind of that questioning of, okay, we know these principles of God is just, we know he's outside of time, perhaps this justice that he's going to be bringing, that's going to be this later time period as well. And so that's really going to be that tension that he's going to continue to explore into chapter 4, is going to be how do we deal with the reality that justice may not occur here in this lifetime. So I think we've, as we wrap up, we've made already a lot of good applications. We've talked about the importance of recognizing our own lack of control over time. Trey, what's a good takeaway you see from this chapter?
Yeah, we've already kind of talked about living in the moment and seizing the day, seizing the time that we've been given, not letting it pass us by. And I think that's really important. Here at the end, this idea of justice and kind of as you're wrestling with this, is justice going to be administered in this life? And as we think about the events that are going on right now and the cries for justice, we absolutely need to be the people who are mourning when there are injustices in the world. That is something that we see time and time again. I mean, we talk about the reasons why Israel went in captivity, and I often like to talk about a three-eyed monster. There was certainly idolatry that was there. There's immorality that's there, but there's also injustice, and that's a big part of it as well. And you see this with other nations too, that nations come crashing down when they become so corrupt and so unjust. The poorest and the lowliest of society are not being taken care of and are being mistreated. All of that is going to be worked out in the end, and we have that hope, we have that assurance. But what can I be doing now? First of all, I need to be somebody who cries out. I need to be somebody who hurts because other people are hurting in this world. But I also need to be somebody who, in my own life, my own interactions, my own experiences, I'm making sure that I'm showing love, that I'm showing light, that I am showing favor to those who may be downtrodden or walked over in other instances. And so I think we can take something of the tenor of the emotion of the preacher here in his cry and his plea for justice to be done. And we can internalize that, and we can then do something about that in our own lives. I'm not saying we can fix the system. I don't know that we can. In fact, I think part of that is just living in the world that we are in. Andrew, as you mentioned, that there's always really been injustice. That was typical of the Old Testament experience. That's typical of our experience today. But at least in my little corner, my little part of the world, in my circle, as much as it depends on me, I'm going to make sure that I am somebody who is helping the weak and making sure that justice is being worked out in my own life. Greg, applications?
Yeah, I think really it comes down to the same type of ideas that Paul reached in Philippians chapter 4, that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That is a recognition that with God, we can accomplish what we need. But we often forget that that verse doesn't mean that I can just get up and fly over interstate traffic because if Christ is on my side, I can do all things. So no more traffic for me. If you haven't gotten, I don't like standing in lines. But in Philippians chapter 4, really the context of that is I have learned in all things to be, this is a powerful word, content. Paul says, I've been brought low and I've had abundance, right? He's lived in every circumstance. He's lived with lots of blessings. He's lived with limited to no blessings and from a materialistic point of view. But either way, he's learned to be content. That's the context for I can do all things through Christ, through him who strengthens me. And so if we realize that we need to let go of the illusion of control, recognize that God's got it, God's going to take care of those injustices, God's going to take care of me when I'm struggling, then I can just live my life. God does the impossible and only asks that we do the possible. Right, that's the faith question over and over in Hebrews 11. Notice God always does the impossible part, but man does the possible. I think best illustrated by faith, the Israelites crossed the Red Sea as though it were dry land. All right, well, what'd they do? They walked across a dry bit of land. Don't consider that to be particularly miraculous until you see some of those old-fashioned movies, the Ten Commandments, and it's quote-unquote awesome technology with the Red Sea and those huge columns. That's a miracle. What the people did was not a miracle, but it was faith. They walked, right? What do we have to do? Well, the preacher realizes we have to work, enjoy life for what it is, embrace it, give up control, live and let God, as we might say. Don't try to make God your co-pilot. That doesn't work. You either get on the plane and go where God the pilot takes you, or you get on your own plane and live out what that means. And the preacher tells us what that means, vanity of vanities. That won't work. Andrew, I'll give you the last word here as we go to wrapping up our study today.
Yeah, I think as we continue to see with Ecclesiastes, there's so much practical wisdom to difficult questions. And that's what, and the Ecclesiastes author is going to continue in chapter 4 to wrestle with this idea of injustice. He's going to continue to wrestle with the idea of finding purpose in this life. And I think this is one of the things that is so valuable about studying the Old Testament. And that's one of the things that I think sometimes we fail to understand how much the Old Testament should be a part of our lives, should be a part of our study. The New Testament assumes you've read this already. The New Testament assumes you are familiar in a lot of capacities with the Old Testament, particularly in its written dynamic. And so if we're not aware of how Qoheleth and how the other authors of the wisdom literature have wrestled with these topics, we're really going to be missing a lot of the perspectives that men like Paul and Peter and the other apostles have, is they're basing it off of these Old Testament scriptures. For the first century, the Old Testament was their Bible. That was what they used and that's what they had. And so hopefully going through Ecclesiastes like this and going through other scriptures shows us how important these texts are to us. It's not just a history book. It's not just a reference to the way people think back then. It is valuable insight from God, from the Holy Spirit to us for our use today. And so I hope everybody is continuing to benefit from this series. I know it has benefited me enormously to study with my brothers and to reap the benefits of their wisdom and their study as well. And so I hope you are enjoying the study. I hope you're getting a lot out of it. We're going to meet again, Lord willing, on Friday. We're going to take a look at chapter 4 again, going to continue a lot of these threads and get a lot more good wisdom from the preacher here. So thank you so much for joining us. We pray for everybody's safety. We hope to see you again on Friday. See you then.